Well, good afternoon. I see Elliott. Do we have Juan and do we have Holly? Let me see. I see Holly.
Hello.
And do we have Juan? Oh, yes, there you are. Great. Wonderful. Okay. Well, welcome back to this session, which is ominously entitled, Where Do We Go From Here? And the idea is we're going to hear reactions to the workshop. We're supposed to be thinking about lingering concerns and remaining questions that the consensus study is going to need to address. And we've got three panelists, and they are certain to express their views. We have Juan Enriquez of Excel Ventures, who is a serial entrepreneur and author, self-avowed futurist. I would say that Juan is always thinking beyond the cutting edge. Elliott Chaikof is a surgeon and an engineer. He is currently the surgeon in chief at the Harvard Medical School affiliated Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center. And Holly Fernandez Lynch, who is trained in both law and bioethics. She's a professor in the Department of Medical Ethics and Health Policy at Penn. And her work, which is formidable and prolific, focuses on a broad array of issues in clinical research ethics. Now, I'm going to ask each of the panel members to share some thoughts, and then we will entertain questions from all of the participants. And again, please use the question and answer function, and we'll try to address as many of them as we can. So let me first call upon Juan, and then I'll ask Elliott, and then we'll finish up with Holly. Juan, please.
So I think it makes sense to keep this as short as possible so we can have as much discussion as possible. There's sort of two things on my mind for the consensus study, and the first is just how often we're surprised by a new technology. So, you know, every day you think you know what's coming, you think you can predict what's coming, and out of the blue, somebody does something like what you were describing, George, with Daley and Neil and Wilma. And the world wasn't ready for that. And as you see, particularly very powerful technologies coming, if you know they're coming or likely to come in the next 2 or 3 years, getting ahead of the ethical issues, bringing people from various perspectives and walks of life into the discussion is incredibly important. So when we were building a programmable life form, we went out of our way to make sure that people who were involved in everything from religion through security through business were part of the discussion as to whether we should do it, how we should do it, what the controls should be, what the ethical considerations are. And that kept it from becoming a topic of huge controversy. And it could have been one. And I think this framework that the consensus study is putting together is just get ahead of this stuff if you can. And sometimes you know when this is coming. In the instances where you don't know that this is coming, you know, we heard this morning how sometimes grants call at the last minute and say, you know, this thing is due in 2 weeks. I don't have much time. Help. And by the way, I don't have any money. That is also similar to the case where suddenly you have a breakthrough. That breakthrough comes out of a place or a lab or an experiment that you don't expect. And then all of a sudden you're behind the 8 ball. And I think you need, you know, the consensus study has to help prepare in cases where you can see where the trends are going to do, what the trends are going to do in things like gene editing, in things like CRISPR, in terms of gene editing being faster, better, cheaper, in terms of emerging brain technologies, in terms of AI as a challenge. I mean, there's 10, 12, 15 different technologies coming down the pike, and you can see those trend lines. And you don't have to predict the future, you just have to ride the trend. And in those instances, I do think it's important that there be a framework of stakeholders and a specific heat map for that technology, which we know is going to be imperfect. It's not one heat map fits all, but it's a, you know what, simply the price of sequencing, simply the price of gene editing, simply the price of gene assembly looks like this. And therefore, the following things may happen over the next 2 to 5 years. For the second instances where we are really surprised, it may make sense to have an ad hoc group that can gather quickly and say, my goodness, we never thought we would be able to clone a Daley, and it just happened. And having that group sort of quickly think through the principles that we're talking about for governance and saying, yeah, this applies, or yeah, this half applies, or wow, we didn't expect this, and how do we think about that? And having that group be international, I think, is especially important, because more and more of these discoveries are going to come out of unexpected places as more and more people get educated, as technology diffuses, as it gets faster, better, cheaper, as the instruments to implement some of this stuff, like a rapid building of a vaccine, or a rapid building of a virus, or a rapid printing of a medicine. As these things come to be, some of the traditional safeguards and mechanisms that, you know, we think about and operate within, it may be that they occur someplace that are either not part of our group yet, or have a very different idea of how to govern that. Which leads to the third question, which is you're going to get this ebb and flow in consensus where nobody thought, you know, a few months ago that Europe and the United States would be so completely aligned on a series of issues, because it looked like they were centripetal. And no one thought that you would have a rogue actor acting to this extent in terms of being irresponsible. And one of the things that worries me in terms of governance of technology over the next 5 years, and maybe over the next 5 months, is that the lessons learned of extraordinary conflicts that you don't see coming, like the Ukraine conflict, is that either the lesson learned is going to be Ukraine should never have given up nukes and needs to get nukes, as well as Kazakhstan, as well as Japan, as well as Germany, as well as Poland, as well as Sweden, and you have a massive proliferation of stuff, or you really begin to take control and disarmament in a much more serious way and bring down the temperature and bring down the number of actors and increase the consequences for this stuff. And that, I think, is a harbinger for a whole series of potential bio or cyber stuff that may or may not have to do with healthcare that may be coming down the pike. And so I guess in summary, prepare where you can, especially looking at trend lines. You're not trying to predict the future. You're trying to run down the trend lines and say, if this trend line continues, let's prepare. Have an ad hoc committee that simply reviews emergency situations that come out of left field that you really didn't expect and could have a huge impact. And build far more of an international framework where legitimacy is established before you need it and is available when you have to stop something. And that's it.
Thank you. Thank you, Juan. Elliott.
Well, I'd like to first congratulate Victor and George, Atul, Alta, Deborah, all the members of CESTI. I've learned a great deal as a participant on this committee in what is truly an important initiative. I reached out to George last night, and he posed 3 questions for me to consider as a reactor. The first was, what was a key insight that I took away from CESTI's work presented at the meeting, and which I hope the consensus study considers? I guess I was particularly struck by the importance of the models of engagement, of public engagement, as highlighted yesterday by the work of Deborah Matthews and the presentations by Dr. Mahmoud Farouk and Jennifer Kuzma. The critical nature of public engagement in technology governance that extends beyond the admittedly extremely important issues of equity, access, affordability, justice, and fairness. Developing a model of deliberative democracy of informed experts together with public citizens, perhaps not for every new technology, but for major emerging technologies, in which non-experts, along with experts, serve as technology evaluators to judge not only the implications of the technology, as well as the relative risks and benefits, but what the data means, its strength, and its merit. The public can and should be more than advisors. The public can and should address issues that extend beyond the questions of whether we ought to move forward with a technology. We should not discount the intellectual and cognitive capacity of the public, regardless of what someone's credentials may or may not be. A deliberative democracy is more than dialogue or informing citizens of the facts or gathering their input. We're living in a period of an increasingly polarized and fractured society. At this moment in time, this is our grand challenge. At the core of our polarization is our current embrace of credentialism, and with it, the hubris of meritocracy. The credentialed few govern the uncredentialed many. And with this framework in place, it should be absolutely no surprise that there is an increasing deficit of trust, particularly in experts. In turn, the inherent bias of experts who lack trust in the decision-making capacity of non-experts is on full display. There is an underlying conceit that the primary source of disagreement is simply a lack of sufficient information, that with a fuller grasp of facts, the correct decisions will be made. Michael Sandel is the Bass Professor of Government Theory at Harvard, and he's written a wonderful book, which I recommend to all, The Tyranny of Merit. Professor Sandel recalls the story of Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who once told an opponent, "You are entitled to your own opinion, but you are not entitled to your own facts." Sandel notes that attributing a disagreement to a simple refusal to face facts or accept science misunderstands the interplay of facts and opinion and persuasion. He argues that the idea we should all agree on the facts as a baseline and then to proceed to debate our opinion is technocratic conceit. Debate is often about how to identify and characterize the facts relevant to the controversy in question. Our opinion directs our perceptions, including whether we trust that the process has been sufficiently transparent and that our government and our corporations will act in our interests. A singularly important governance challenge for the consensus panel is the creation of a public space for deliberation for both experts and non-experts that gathers people together across class, race, ethnicity, and faith. The second question that George posed to me was, what do I see as the next step for advancing emerging technology governance to promote social good? As highlighted by George, the challenge for the consensus study is to define the tools for good governance, tools that promote collaborative work and policy coherence and convergence for a common goal. There are a variety of governance tools that can foster coherence, collaboration, and partnership, but at a practical level, these tools will fall into four categories. First, tools that create appropriate structures, committees and organizations dedicated to collaboration, This may include a recommendation for a cabinet level committee, perhaps at the level of the OSTP, to demonstrate a high level of political commitment to increase the likelihood of success for interdepartmental work. The creation of an interdepartmental committee to foster intersectoral work, a steering committee to ensure cross-agency implementation of any plan that is coordinated by a nominated lead agency, with clearly defined critical cross-agency dependencies and responsibilities, and appropriate collaborative interfaces with non-government networks and organizations. Secondly, governance tools related to processes for joint planning, priority setting, and evaluation to ensure that there is a shared common goal. Thirdly, governance tools supporting a financial framework that creates mechanisms fostering intersectoral activities, financial support mechanisms for partnership activities, or joint agreements on financing. And finally, governance tools related to mandates, laws, or regulations opposing accountability. Who takes the lead and who is ultimately responsible? The third and final question was, building on CESTI's work to date, what topic or issue area do you think the consensus committee should explore further? And I think that there are two issues that came to my mind. First, I would hope that any governance framework facilitates innovation and ensures all technology-related risks are mitigated. But shouldn't a sound framework also identify when traditional free market incentives are not aligned to drive technology development, which nonetheless is in the public good? Does our governance framework account for future scenarios where the traditional drivers will not move forward with a technology despite potential public benefits? Can a governance framework identify the need for new policy incentives to drive value generation, to accelerate investments in new emerging innovative technologies? And secondly, how do we ensure that our governance structure and processes that are designed do the most good it can do? As we've heard today and yesterday, what are the metrics of success for the governance tools that are put into place? How do we measure success? And are the tools actually being used and in the manner intended? Thank you.
Elliott, thank you very, very much. Holly, please.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for having me. It's a little bit challenging to, give comments towards the end of a fabulous 2-day series. It's been great to hear about the work that's been done so far, the work that is yet to come. And I appreciate, George, you saying that we should talk about lingering questions and concerns, because most of what I have on my mind are lingering questions. So there's plenty of work for this committee to do over the next several years. Listening to the conversation over the past couple of days, the thing that stands out to me most is who should we hold responsible and accountable to identify and address these issues related to ethical development and implementation of emerging technologies, right? So who is it that's going to be using the heat map, and who's going to act on it, and who's going to do the enforcing, and who's going to say no, right? And what is the threshold for saying no, right? That has to be something that stays on the table. It's not the case that we are necessarily trying to make sure that every development can happen, that there may be some things that ought not to happen, or at least not happen yet. I appreciated hearing the conversation yesterday, laying the primary responsibility in the laps of scientists and developers, right? We have to make sure that it is clear to those who are doing this work that they bear responsibility for it, and that the ethics are not something to leave till later, or to outsource to their IRBs or their ethics consultants, but something that they have to take on themselves, not alone, but that the buck stops with them. Policymakers, of course, bear responsibility in this space. It's been recognized already, but I think it's a major challenge which these technologies cut across different regulators and different jurisdictions, and it's going to require just a tremendous amount of collaboration. I'm heartened by the collaboration we've seen in the context of COVID, for example, between private industry and the government in different parts of the government that didn't always collaborate so well in the past, but it makes it very difficult when you have these regulatory parameters or potential parameters that are so cross-cutting, because it makes it hard for even conscientious actors who want to do the right thing in developing their technology to get things right, because it's not going to be clear exactly what's required of them. We had a little bit of conversation yesterday about the role of IRBs or IRB-like entities. And you could almost feel the collective cringing, like, not IRBs. What is it? Is it going to be something that looks like IRBs? What could it be as an alternative to IRBs? And there, I think we need to kind of take a step back and think about some more preliminary principles. Should we be talking about pre-review or not? At what level should the review occur? Should it occur at institutions, at the federal government level, at the international level? And should we be looking at review of specific projects? Should the review be kind of across an entire domain so that specific projects don't need, that pre-review, but there's kind of a broader expectation and people will know what they're supposed to do in that field? And then this big question about how do we evaluate successful oversight? We don't have a good way, other than hearing a lot of complaints, we don't have a good way of evaluating the success of IRBs, for example, or other oversight bodies. So I think it's great that the conversation that started to think about quality metrics. And then if we think about responsibility, right, I'm glad to hear this conversation about public engagement, because these things are going to affect everyone. And so we all have this shared responsibility to make sure that the science is developed and implemented in an ethically appropriate way. That leads to the second set of questions that I have that builds on what you were saying, Elliott, around these questions about public engagement. And yesterday during that panel, I kept thinking, when can we rely on our elected policymakers? And when do we need to do it ourselves in terms of, direct democracy? And when is it okay to just maybe rely on something in between? Certainly, the public has a stake in the principles that can guide this science. But we also, I think, have to be realistic in recognizing that there's kind of a policy-making division of labor, right? Not every member of the public can be deeply informed and engaged about every issue that might expect them. So how can we decide who should engage with which issues and how significant their engagement should be? When can we, as members of the public, rely on non-governmental organizations, consumer advocacy organizations, patient advocacy organizations to represent our interests versus having kind of individuals, serve as their own spokespeople? So that was something I've been thinking a bit about since yesterday. Deep questions about who is the relevant public and how do we reach people who may not even realize that they would be affected by some of these technologies when we're in very early stages. And then, as Elliott was mentioning, it's not the case that our role in this field should be to just inform the public, right? But we do need to make sure that public opinion is informed so that the public can be appropriately engaged. I don't know that we have yet come up with a good mechanism for achieving conflict resolution when we engage the public. And I am deeply concerned about how to do good public engagement in a deeply divided American society when it seems like we can't even agree on the most basic issues and that there's a deep distrust in those that are viewed as being on the other side. And so I think that's going to be a challenge for this committee and basically for, all policymaking questions. And then I just had kind of a couple of other stray points for the committee to consider. One is recognize an emerging area in bioethics, which thinks about risks to bystanders. So, in the context of institutional review boards, attention has really focused traditionally on the people who are defined as research participants. And there is a question, is it within scope for IRBs, for example, to think about those who are not directly enrolled in research, but might be influenced negatively by research itself or the outcomes of that research? If IRBs aren't the right people to, groups to think about that, who would be the right groups to think about that? And what are our obligations when bystander interests might come into conflict with research participant interests or the interests of those who could benefit from the results of the research? It leads me to another kind of deep challenge in research ethics, which is that I don't think we have a good systematic mechanism of defining and evaluating social value, right? What we do, what we are expected to do in a lot of research ethics is to evaluate benefit and risk. But we have a very difficult time, I think, figuring out, what benefits should count, how certain are we about those benefits? And I think often benefit is assumed that may not actually come to fruition. And so I think we need to be a bit more careful about that. That relates to something that you raised, George, about being careful with regard to hype and avoiding overhype, right? So as we think about benefit and risks, we have to be very careful to not put our thumb on the scale of benefit and assume that some of these technologies are going to be more beneficial and have more promise than they really do. The last point that I wanted to raise is a little bit tricky, right? Because the mission of CESTI, as I understand it, is to focus specifically on tech innovation and scientific innovation. But it's been a challenge for bioethics that we focus, and we've been criticized for focusing on the new, shiny, sexy things in a way that distracts from urgent and persistent equity challenges. So, for example, bioethicist Keisha Ray and others have noted, that we totally understand the causes and impacts of inequity in healthcare and health outcomes, but we pay disproportionately low attention to those kinds of low-tech things and disproportionately high attention to these shiny new, scientific developments. And so, as Dr. Ray puts it, for example, right, we asked for racial equity and they gave us pig hearts, right? And she was commenting on, the recent advancements in xenotransplantation. This came up in Dr. Reardon's talk, right, emphasizing the importance of justice and bioethics and raising the, primacy of that principle. We can and should pay attention both to existing structural and societal inequities and to making sure that technological developments are done in an ethically appropriate way. But I just, I can't leave it unremarked, right, that we have not solved some of these very low-tech challenges, and we can't lose sight of those.
Wow. That just far exceeds my expectations for the panel. Holly, you raised so many critical issues that I do think still linger and will be on the agenda for the consensus study. And Elliott, I hope that we can get the text of what you delivered, because it's really a roadmap for many of the considerations. And Juan, I just have to always thank you for reminding us how imperfect our ability to see the future is, which leaves us with all sorts of challenges. I again encourage participants to put their questions in the Q&A function. We've got, I think, about 10 minutes in order to deal with some of these. I want to focus on one of the important questions that I think essentially all three of you raised, which is who should own the governance in a sense? I mean, we can characterize it or we can describe the question in various ways. I think, Holly, you said, who should be held accountable? Who is responsible? who is doing this? How do we, and if we're going to think of whatever governance framework emerges from the consensus study, how are we going to be able to judge its assimilation and effectiveness? I know the panel was supposed to pose the questions, but I'm also going to perhaps ask you to think about some ideas for how you might answer those questions. Any thoughts on the accountability and responsibility for governance issues?
So, George, I think one of the big trends in this, which is really important, is faster, better, cheaper has not really moved through most of medicine. In fact, it's been almost the opposite of Moore's law. It gets more expensive and less efficient every year. And I think there's a whole series of technologies, especially having to do with electronics, with printing, with the ability of individuals to make stuff, that are going to start pushing faster, better, cheaper. And to your question of governance, it takes these big centralized institutions and it provides the ability to do end runs around them, especially as you get stuff that is designed for consumers but also has a medical application.
Elliott, thoughts or Holly on this issue?
Yeah, defer first to Holly. Is the issue again? I was actually taking a look at Alta's question in the chat, but is the issue really about sort of this? Again, what struck me when I was thinking about this is how do you ensure political commitment? Because I think political commitment at the highest level will help drive the success of these collaborative processes. I think that ultimately will be an important level of engagement. If we have that political commitment at the highest levels, it doesn't ensure success, but it certainly might catalyze a process towards success and towards ensuring that all these agencies and these cross-sectoral gaps that we've been struggling with to close actually may be achieved. There are many other components to success other than that, collaboration with the public, a variety of other components, but what sort of drove or at least motivated, I think, CESTI to begin with was the fact that we have these silos that are in place, and how can we ensure that they're bridged, and what can catalyze as a bridging mechanism. And so that's why I think the role of the OSTP, at least as one component, may be critical in this process.
I'll just add, I alluded to this in my remarks, but I think that the accountability has to start with the scientists and the developers. And that relates to the kind of training that they get, that they have to be asking these ethics questions right from the very beginning of their projects and their designs and their research questions. And again, this gets back to, Dr. Reardon's comments about engaging appropriate expertise from the very start, that this is not something that can be put off for another day. And I'm not suggesting that that everybody needs to, be able to do it themselves, right? But they do need to be aware of the ethics questions that their projects might raise, or at the very least be willing to ask themselves, what are the ethical challenges that might come up in this project? Where could I get additional help? Where I would take things off the individual scientists or teams of scientists a little bit is on the public engagement side of things, because that requires a whole other layer of expertise. I think it's great that organizations like CESTI can engage the public, right? Or OSTP or other entities can engage the public. I don't know that we need to have the scientists and the developers do that and reinvent the wheel each time and, go to kind of very small subsets of the public that they will be able to effectively engage. I think that could happen on a wider level to get public engagement on these broader ethical principles to apply to emerging technologies.
I was just going to say that I couldn't agree more. I think, the questions that we don't often ask ourselves are, what are the risks and have we done enough to mitigate them? And, I think the challenge for scientists is that we're told to have this fine balance between focus and being overly ambitious. And in most focus projects, we're just trying to see if something is working, let alone consider all these other factors that come into play. But I think pushing that training earlier on, having people bring that mindset to the work that they're doing, whether in academia or in industry, I think is an important framework that's often lacking.
Excellent. I think, Holly, you articulated it so clearly, and I think we had some discussions early on in CESTI. It didn't quite make its way into sort of a core principle, but certainly should be something that could be written into a preamble for any kind of framework, which is this notion, I've called it in the past, sort of regulatory humility, or the willingness of scientists and innovators to assume and accept and defer to the responsibility for some external oversight, that we will somehow acquiesce to that. It's part of our responsibility to have the privilege of being innovators and being scientists, especially when we're funded by the public. But then you articulated the responsibility for governance to some extent. That's got to be at a larger institutional level, and that's where we start to think about what are the institutions. We act locally within our own institutions, but there are institutions that, like the national academies, that essentially do have a status at the national level, and there are academies that have similar at the international level. So I think this is clearly something the consensus study is going to have to think about. From the point of view of education and culture, Jenny Reardon made that point so well. We really need to embed it very, very early in the process. And I think we need to evolve the scientific curriculums for PhD programs. We need to be able to be sure that all of our folks who are likely to be the innovators of the future are steeped in this expectation and think of it first, not after the fact.
And George, let me just add one other quick thing, which is no matter how good and strong your governance structure is, there will be individuals who find ways around it, right? And that's why I think it's so important for the individuals to understand what their ethical obligations are, right? And if you, not everyone is always going to do the right thing, right? There will be bad actors out there, right? But I do think if you kind of bake it in and say, this is your ethical responsibility, that can make a difference.
Well, Holly, I was going there next because Juan, I think, was the one who raised the issue that, there are going to be rogue actors. So how does the consensus study think about and make recommendations around rogue actors? Juan, any thoughts?
Let me address that in two ways. There's rogue actors who act in a deliberately nasty fashion or destructive fashion. And there are people who seem like rogue actors who are going completely against what we think is right, that end up being right in the long run. Because sometimes the ethics of what we think is right and wrong flips 180 degrees. And so right now, we would probably think gene editing babies, unless if there's a clear deadly condition, is a horrible idea. But it may be that by our grandkids' times, they will be furious if you didn't take out their KRAS P53 BRCA genes. And the logic will just flip 180 degrees as this stuff gets faster, better, cheaper. And so as you're thinking about road actors, I think, there's deliberately evil rogue actors who are trying to hurt things. And that I think you have to involve and have conversations with some of the security services. And then there are rogue actors who are doing stuff that the four of us might find objectionable, but may turn out to be right in the long run. And to your point about medical education, one of the ways you get into medical school is you get the right answer every time and you're perfect. And then you have to have this schizophrenic thing where you have to be a researcher and be willing to completely flip your point of view if the evidence points you in a different way. And to Elliott's point, we need a bridge to society that explains how and why you can change your mind, why it's okay to change your mind, even on things like ethics, not just research. And that bridge and that communication is just a very difficult thing to achieve and a very difficult balance. Because we as a committee could say this stuff is right and this is wrong, and then find that a rogue actor comes in and pushes us so hard and makes us so uncomfortable, and a new technology comes in that we end up on the other side.
Juan, I think that's a great point, but can I just quickly,
Please.
The role of ethicists is not to say this is right and this is wrong, and we are sure, and it will forever be true that this is right and this is wrong. I think the really important thing is to know these are the questions that we have to ask to figure out what is justifiable and what is not justifiable. And there might be reasonable disagreement about those things, but if you haven't even asked yourself the question about what are the risks, who's going to be affected by this, who could be harmed by it, who are the winners and losers, then you're certainly not going to be able to address the challenges.
Yes. Yeah, it's really about the primacy of the process, the deliberative process, and the principles on which that process are based. We have hands up from Victor and Keith, and I've just been instructed we could maybe take a couple of more minutes, but we are going over time. So Victor, please. And we can't hear you. There you are.
Thank you. I want to ask the panelists for their reaction to the way that I'm thinking. First of all, recognize that this is only the beginning of a process, and none of this would be the final solution. In fact, as we discussed earlier, this may be an iterative process, ongoing until we get it right, or every time we get better. I think the way that some of us, at least I'm thinking about this, would be the steps are: one, we do need a formal process of recommendation through the consensus study. Second, this has to be a collective effort, inclusive, whereby as you arrive at it, I think most people would say, yes, it's the right thing to do and we'll support it. Third is we're going to go through a series of experience by bringing together a governance process that is inclusive, that will try to apply the recommendation of the consensus study. Fourth is that we hope that organization like OSTP, which has expressed a great interest, can create guidelines. And then I think over time, this can become a standard practice. Like in life, things which are beginning as a voluntary effort becomes a more standard expectation. Let's take the climate issue. As you know, it's very difficult to talk about climate change and responsibilities. However, the ESG conversation has pushed many companies towards this incentive issue, so to speak, towards recognizing how important it is. And now, ever more important, they are now working together towards developing standards. And of course, with SEC coming out to say, we are considering this provision, that moves things faster. So I actually think this may be a multi-step process that goes from a coalition of the willing to become standard practice. And to your point about what do you do about rogue actors? Well, there'll be laws. There's governance to regulation. And that governance would include the consideration for regulation, which obviously would be in strictly applied in the government and not this kind of effort. But I think they are continuum and they work together. I want to see your reaction particularly from Holly or Elliott or Juan in terms of this thinking.
Full endorsement, it sounds like.
Yeah,
Holly?
I agree with you. I mean, I'm struggling to add anything to that. I agree with everything that you've laid out.
Well articulated. Well, Keith, I think Keith gets the last. We are going to take just 1 or 2 more minutes to hear from Keith. Keith, I hope we haven't made your task too much more difficult. You will get the last question here, though.
I think it's great that this has been a fantastic panel, and I really appreciated and resonated to Holly's comments of who's going to own this process. And it's a really important one. And Elliott's answer to that question in a way of invoking a role for OSTP. It turns out that I co-chair a committee that actually Victor is on that stood up before the pandemic, before the 2020 election. If anybody can remember back to that lifetime, something called the Science and Technology Action Plan, in which we invoked a role for the OSTP, first of all, elevating the OSTP director to the cabinet, which, as we all know, happened. And second, invoking, conferring on OSTP, both the resources and the responsibility to serve as a coordination function, a bridge across the science and technology agencies in the federal government, and then out to the private sector, to put focus on particular issues that are of importance. We raised existential challenges in health and energy and environment and food that you would all name in the same way that we did. But it's telling that what we did not do, right, is to invoke a role of that OSTP coordination function to include and consider ethical principles. It's exactly the kinds of things that CESTI has been doing, and exactly the kind of problem that, in a way, you have been wrestling with, which is that, and calling upon ethicists 2 weeks before a grant is due, says that these things are the trailing edge of our thinking about all of these processes. And I think that what CESTI has done is to say, no, you got it wrong. It's got to be at the beginning. You know, if it's not the first step, it's got to be early, because the implications for what we do and don't do, for what we get right and don't get right, are so wrapped up in those principles that if we start without thinking about them first, it's very likely we're going to get it wrong. So I really appreciate that, and this thinking and from this group about who should own it and where it should go is really, really important. If invoking this role for OSTP raises concerns about another point that Elliott made of the hubris of expertise, and how to avoid that, how to involve the public in a functional way. But I think that there's a great roadmap here that you've laid out in this session, and I really appreciate it. So thank you.
Great, Keith, thank you so much. I think that's a wonderful segue to the next discussion of the statement of task for your consensus study. I just want to thank Holly and Juan and Elliott. Your comments were spot on, very provocative, and it was a joy. It's a great conclusion to the work of CESTI as we now turn it over to the statement of task for the consensus study. Thanks.